Hey guys, welcome to the show. Today I have a very special guest, Dru Hammer. She has written a new book called Hammered, and it's all about her life. She has a fascinating life. She is the granddaughter-in-law of Armand Hammer, the legendary business tycoon. And she's also the mother of Armie Hammer, the famous actor who was in Social Network. He played the Winklevoss twins. He also was in Call Me by Your Name with Timothy Chalamet, which was basically, that movie was basically a gay love story. And we're going to talk about when she found out that Armie got cast in that movie, her reaction. And we're going to get into all of these fascinating details about her life. Please welcome Dru Hammer.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. You know how I love and adore hanging out with you. So this is so much fun.
I know, and I just love this book is so good. Hammered, your new book.
Oh, thank
It
you.
was I mean, it was seriously just like a page turner. I loved it so much, and there's
Oh,
so much
thank
in it. But let's start with, before we get into the Hammer family and how you got into that family, let's talk about your childhood, which was really idyllic, and
Yes.
how your parents raised you, and what your father ended up doing in terms of ministry and his company. So talk about how your early kind of growing up years in Oklahoma.
Okay. Well, it really truly was idyllic. If you could ever say, I wish I had the perfect family, I actually did. And my parents had become believers when I was only 4 or 5 years old, and it completely changed their entire lives. I mean, it shifted everything, which is basically the way it's supposed to be, right? I
Yeah.
mean, when we bring Christ into our life, you had that encounter. It changed your entire life, everything you did, even the way you thought, the people you hung out with. And that's what my parents did. And they had Bible studies and prayer meetings in the house. And I remember as a child, my room was right above the living room, and they would have Bible studies once a week, and they would be worshiping the Lord, and music and singing and praying in tongues. And I remember lying in bed, and I was such a young child. And I remember thinking, wow, there are angels in our home. That's what it sounded like to me when they were worshiping the Lord. So my parents raised us in the Lord, but they were not religious. They just loved Jesus. And I think there's a big difference. You can
Mhm.
go through the motions of religion, you can go to church or mass or whatever every Sunday and still not have a personal relationship with Jesus. And because my parents were never raised in any kind of religion, that literally my dad would say things to us like, Dru, I don't even know what the different religions believe, but here's what I know. The longest distance in the world is 12 inches. It's moving God from here down to a personal heart experience. And when you hear that as a child, and I remember in high school, my dad would say, well, honey, I'm not even going to give you a curfew. We trust you. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. How can you rebel when your parents say that to you? Right. So I was just always this good girl, and I taught Bible studies in my sorority house in college, and it's kind of all I knew. And what a blessing that is. And it's really funny because I heard a podcast from my son, Armie, and, he didn't quite have the exact same memories of the idyllic home growing up that I did. And I was like, well, wait a minute. My parents were amazing. Why don't you think I was perfect as a mother? But it's a learning curve. We'll say it that way.
Yes. Well, we're gonna get to Army in a little bit, but
Yeah.
so, and then in high school, you had your dad decide, when you were in high school, your dad decided to, I don't know if he decided to sell his businesses or just kind of put them on the side and go into full-time ministry. Talk about that.
Okay. Well, actually, he didn't go into full-time ministry. He worked until he was 86 years old and died at 87. But what he did is at the time he ended up, and they were both raised extremely poor. But at the time, my dad had already owned several banks and developed land and had lumber yards, et cetera, et cetera. And when he felt like the Lord had called him into a healing ministry, he kind of made a deal with God, if you will. He said, you know what, Lord, I don't think there's anything wrong with ministries asking for, donations or asking, to give into their ministry, because I always say, the gospel's free. Jesus paid the price, but ministry is expensive. But the way my dad wanted to do it is he said, God, if you will continue to bless my businesses, then I will give a portion into a foundation, because I never want to take up an offering and I want to pay for everything. And that's such freedom in that way of doing it, because you don't have to worry about raising funds. And, the amazing part about it is you just can't outgive God. And every time my dad would give money from his businesses, for example, right after he made that deal with God, he sold, two men walked into his office the next week and bought two of his banks, and he put a large portion of that into his foundation to start his ministry. And from then on, that's what he did for 60 years, and God just kept providing. You can never outgive God. But when that happened, I was a senior in high school, and I'm, not bragging, because who cares about this stuff? But, I was homecoming queen and in the it group, if you will. And all of a sudden, Tulsa's a small town, and it comes out on the front page of the Tulsa World, Doug Mobley, Tulsa banker, sells his bank downtown and goes into a healing ministry. Well, Tulsa, Oklahoma, I always say, is probably the buckle of the Bible Belt. But when that comes out in the paper, you're a weirdo, because this supernatural healing stuff, I always say there's different degrees of faith in Christianity. And if you believe for the supernatural, which I believe we serve a supernatural God, I mean, if it says it in the Bible, I go for it. But when that comes down the front page of the Tulsa World, all of a sudden nobody would be my friend. I was completely isolated and kicked out. And when you're a senior in high school, it's a very self-absorbed time of your life. So I kept thinking, could my dad not have waited one more year till I was out of high school before he does this? But that wasn't God's plan, because another thing happened. You want me to tell the story?
Yeah.
You and I have already talked about all this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, so when it was in the paper at the time, there was the white pages. We didn't have cell phones or anything like that. And people started, I know, isn't that terrible?
The white pages. I love it.
I know, right? And people started calling my dad and asking him to come pray for them to be healed. And one night, it was a snowy night, and my mother wanted to stay home with my younger sister. And he came to me and he said, hey, Dru, will you come with me to pray for this woman? She's single, lives alone, and it's not proper for me to go into her house by myself. And, I was like, oh, whatever. Okay. Because I'm just not having it at this point. Not that I didn't believe it, but it just didn't fit into my social calendar, if you know what I mean. So we drive out, and it was a snowy night. And when I tell this story, a lot of people look at me like I have three eyes or something. But it's kind of one of those stories. It's like, well, why would you ever make up something like that? It's so supernatural that you'd be a crazy person to make it up. But what happened is we drive out to this woman's home, and she lived in an old, broken down trailer home in a trailer park. And you could tell that she literally was down to her last days. And I remember walking in to her home and thinking, wow, it smells like death. Well, I had never smelt death before, but I just innately knew that she was very close to death. And what she told my father was that the doctors literally said the cancer's all throughout your body. And, cancer research was not what it was. I mean, what it is today. So they basically sent her home to die. And she was completely bald. She weighed probably 80 pounds, skin and bones, and she was gray. And my dad said, well, do you know Jesus as your Lord and Savior? Because that's your first miracle, and that's eternal. And she said, yes, I do. And then my dad asked her, do you believe Jesus can heal you? And she said, yes, I believe so. So we laid hands on her and my dad started praying. And I opened my eyes, Becket, and I literally saw her hair grow out of her head. And I know, right? I
Wow.
mean, it's one of these things where, but you know what, Beckett, if you really think about it, why would we ever limit the creator of the universe? You know, so many people could put God in a box. Oh, he doesn't heal today. All the gifts of the spirit are not for today. You know, they all went away when the disciples died. And I'm like, well, where did that come from? Because
Mhm.
all I know is Jesus says greater things, not even the same, greater things will you do, because I will send back the Holy Spirit. And then he commissioned us, go out into the world, spread the gospel, lay hands on the sick and they will recover, and rebuke the demons and they must flee. Well, you know, I take God at his word. And if he says it, I'm going for it. But I needed to see that. So when I saw that, the Lord spoke to me and said, I'm going to send you into a very big world. Don't ever deny my power.
Wow. Well, let's talk about that big world. So, how did you meet
That was
Michael
a good
Hammer?
segue,
That
wasn't
was a
it?
good. How did
I
you
just
meet?
teed you right up
Yes,
on
you
that
teed me
one.
up. How did you meet Michael Hammer, the grandson of the legendary Armand Hammer? How did you guys meet? Because he lived in California, you lived in Tulsa.
Yes,
How
that's
in the
right.
world did you guys meet?
Exactly. That had to have been God. So when Michael, he went to Columbia and got his MBA, and after that, he worked on Wall Street, and Armand called him because Armand only had one child, and his name was Julian,
Mhm.
who, you know, well, let's just say I never met or even knew people existed like Julian in this world. He was basically a mess. And he was the only child of Armand. And then Julian had Michael and then Michael's sister. And what happened is when Michael was working on Wall Street, Armand called him one day and he said, you're basically all I've got. So I want you to come work for Occidental and I want you to learn the ropes and I want you to see what I do with my foundation, because someday you'll be taking, you know, the foundation over. And Armand sent Michael to all the offices around the world for 2 years. He lived in London and Oman and all over the world. And would you believe his last stop was Tulsa, Oklahoma, because they had bought City Service, which was the domestic side of Occidental Petroleum. And that's the company that Armand started. So he was there only for 3 weeks. And I had gone down to Houston to play in a mixed doubles tennis tournament. And he walked on our plane in Dallas. And the funny thing is, well, the God thing is we lost in the semifinals. So we took an earlier flight back. It was Labor Day weekend. And Michael missed his flight and got the last flight to Tulsa that evening. And he walked on the plane. And I was like, wow, it was honestly one of those crazy love at first sight, if you will.
Mhm.
And obviously he was interested too. God orchestrated it to where a woman switched seats, if you can believe it. And he ended up sitting next to me. So the three of us were talking. And afterwards, he came up to me and he said, well, this is kind of the bad part. And I have to admit, I was dating John, my doubles partner, but it was nothing serious. And he said, well, is that your boyfriend or fiance? And I go, oh, heavens, no. Isn't that awful? I know, I'm such a bad person. And he said, well, may I take you to lunch tomorrow? And I said, I would love that. So we go to lunch. And of course, immediately I start telling him about Jesus because that's just who I am. And by the way, why waste your time? If they're
What
not
was his
interested.
reaction to this?
Well, this is the amazing part is when I started talking to him about Jesus, you can tell if people are actually listening or if they're
Mhm.
humoring you.
Yeah.
And he was listening. And after I told him how I was raised in this amazing, godly Christian family, and that I invited Jesus into my life at 5, and that I would never be with anyone who didn't believe in Jesus like I do, because we'd be unequally yoked. You know, I went through the whole spiel that you go through. And he kept listening. And afterwards, he goes, wow, can I tell you something? And I said, yes. He said, my grandmother, Olga, she was a Russian baroness and she was a Russian Orthodox and she loved Jesus. And she had a home in Laguna. And Michael would go down and stay with her for several weeks every summer. And she always talked to him about Jesus. And she even had crucifixes around the house. And he said, my grandmother and I would kneel down and pray before we went to bed at night. And we would pray before meals. And he said, Dru, it's the only place in my life where I ever felt safe. And we realized it was the only Christian influence he had had in his life, which is interesting because as a child, you may not cognizantly know that it's because of Jesus, but he just knew he felt safe there.
Mhm. Yeah.
And she died when he was in the 7th grade. And he said, it broke my heart because his life with his parents was very chaotic and a lot of fighting, violence, the whole thing. And he said, it broke my heart when she died because I used to lay in bed and think, gosh, I wish I could run away and just live with my grandmother. So when you were talking to me about Jesus, Dru, I felt that same safe feeling that I felt when I was with her as a child. So isn't God amazing how he prepared Michael, if you will?
Wow. And so what was it like? So, and then you guys obviously decided to get married. How
Oh,
long?
we were engaged in 3 weeks and married in 4 months. I know, it was just one of those crazy. I'll never forget when he actually proposed to me. We were in Midland. He had to go down there for an oil deal, and he had an aunt and uncle that lived there. So we went down there and stayed with them. And it was so funny because we were driving to a restaurant one night and he stopped the car. Not exactly the most romantic way of doing this, but he says to me, he says, Dru, I am madly in love with you. Will you marry me? And I answered him and I said, well, what took you so long? We go back. I mean, it's like, are you kidding me? I know, 3 weeks. But it was right. And the interesting thing is Michael was very broken because he came from a very abusive background. His father was an alcoholic, addicted to prescription drugs, and he abused Michael in every way, if you will. And he suppressed it. And I didn't know enough coming from my little Pentecostal background. I just thought you go to church and pray about it when you have problems. I
Mm.
wish I knew then what I know now. We should have been in years of Christian counseling, not because we didn't have a great relationship. I tell everybody I had a fabulous marriage. Well, he just had a better time than I did. But
Yes, we'll get to that in a minute, but go ahead.
yeah, well, it is what it is. But actually, I had people ask me, well, do you think you missed that wasn't the person God had for you? I go, heck no. We had a fabulous life and a fabulous marriage. And I have 2 sons that I love more than life itself. And the thing is that's why my book is titled Hammered, because every heart has been hammered. But God never fails us. People fail us. And when we've been hammered by life, that's when God does his greatest work. He comes in and he restores us. He restores our joy, our peace in every way he does.
And so what was it like when you first kind of entered into this whole Hammer family? What was that like entering this new world coming
Oh
from
my
Tulsa,
gosh.
Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Right? Oh, I was Ellie Mae Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies. Are you kidding? I mean, I two-stepped on the weekends, but I will say one of my claim to fame is Garth Brooks was the local band, and we two-stepped to him every weekend in college because I was
That's
dating
hilarious.
ranchers, and I know. So I was very unprepared, to be perfectly honest. And I also marveled at how unhappy people seem to be. Because in your mind, if you don't, I mean, we grew up having money, but my parents were extremely conservative and they believed that you are blessed to be a blessing, and their money was a tool that God had given them to go help others. So
Mhm.
we never lived an opulent life. We lived very humble lives. As a matter of fact, my dad was so humble that he would buy a new car every year, but he'd always make sure he bought the same kind and the same color so nobody knew he had a new car. And I'm like,
I
Dad,
love
I don't
that.
think anybody cares if you have a new car or not. But anyway, we'll move on from that. But I get thrown into this crazy, crazy world. And I thought I had landed in the twilight zone, but God had a plan. He just
And
did.
and then I think the first meeting you had with Armand Hammer, Michael's grandfather, you he took you, he said he asked to, after dinner or whatever, he asked you to come into his office and he wanted a conversation. He wanted to make a request from you. Tell us about that, and then your request back to him.
Well, you have a cheat sheet from dinner, so you already know these stories.
Well, I have a cheat sheet from this book. Yes.
Well, that's true. That's true. Well, we covered a lot that night. Well, it was really funny because I'm not sure, that I really even knew the extent of what I was getting into, because we didn't have Google, or you couldn't look that stuff up. And personally, I thought, well, Armand Hammer, probably baking soda. And I knew he was in the oil business, but I really didn't know that much. So we go over his house for Christmas, and I'm used to the Norman Rockwell Christmas, and we have matching monogrammed flannel Christmas pajamas every year, and we bake cookies, and we go down to church and have a Christmas Eve service, candlelit, and the whole thing. And I remember we flew to LA after we were engaged to spend Christmas morning with Armand and his family, and there's only 5 of them. So we walk into his house, and there's a limousine as long as his house out front, and we walk in, and there's a man in a tuxedo playing a grand piano in the living room, and there were 5 people here. So I kind of start looking around thinking, well, I wonder who else is coming. I mean, they have entertainment here. I mean, that just didn't make sense to me. And then it was like this huge tub of Russian caviar and Russian vodka on the table, and they sat there and small talked, and I was like, wow, because my family, we get down to the nitty gritty. I mean, we're all over, we're all into everybody's business, I guess you could say. And it was very obvious to me that they didn't even really know each other. It was pleasantries and niceties, if you will.
Yeah.
And we go into the dining room, and he rings the bell, and the staff comes in in their organza aprons and their black, tuxedos. And, I'm thinking, okay, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. And we go, and Becket, do you remember those 1940s movies where the dining room table is so long that you can't even touch the people next to you?
Yes.
That would be it. And all of a sudden he rings the bell again, and this procession comes out with the huge silver trays with the the big silver domes over it. And I'm thinking, you've got to be kidding me. And we exchanged pleasantries again at dinner. And then Armand came up to me and said, I would really like to visit with you in my office. Well, I look back and I say, thank God I really didn't know who he was, because I would have been like, you've got to be kidding me. What are we going to talk about? But I was like,
and you were, how old
okay.
were you at this point?
I was 23.
Okay.
I was a kid.
You were a kid, and you go into Armand Hammer's office, and what happens?
Well, I walk in and I start laughing, and he looked at me and he said, what's so funny? I said, you have a private library in the Dewey Decimal System? I just thought that was the funniest thing in the world. It's like, who does that, right? So he seats me in front of his desk, and he said, what are your hobbies? And I said, well, I grew up playing tennis. He picks up a phone, and he calls somebody on Christmas Day, and he said, my new daughter-in-law to be is with me, and she's a tennis player, so I'd like for you to get her a membership at Riviera Country Club. Click. And I'm like, this man has a bat phone. Are you kidding me? And I think
within Riviera Country Club is not easy to get into, by the way.
No, and I think I had it within a week. I don't know how it happened. I guess executives at Oxy were on the board. Who knows? But I was in. So I'm thinking, wow, I should have asked for a lot more, right? Just kidding. So then he says to me, I'd like to ask you a favor. And I said, okay. He said, my grandson, I want him to start traveling the world with me and learning the businesses inside and out and how I run my foundation. And I think it's best that married couples stay together. So I'm going to ask you not to work, because I want you to have the ability to travel with him. And I'm sitting there, and again, thank God I didn't really understand who he was. And I leaned in and I go, is that a trick question?
I
And
get to
he
travel
just,
the world and
I'm like,
on
huh,
private planes.
let me
Yeah.
think about this one. I'm gonna need a week, right? So I was like, oh my gosh. Well, when I leaned in and said that, he started laughing because I don't think anyone ever spoke to him like that. Here's this naive 23-year-old pipsqueak that really doesn't know who he is. And I'm like asking him if it's a trick question. And I just think he got a kick out of me from then on because nobody ever talked to him like that. And, I'm thinking, well, he's a 5'6" man. I could beat him up if I had to. Why is everybody so afraid of him? Everyone was, always kind of walking on eggshells. But anyways, so I said, okay, I'm happy to do that, but I have a favor to ask of you. I mean, can you imagine? I look back and I'm like, you are ridiculous. I said, I would like to ask you something. And he said, well, what would that be? I said, Dr. Hammer, I would like to invite you to our home every Sunday that you're in town because my family, we have Sunday supper. So I'm inviting you to our home because I'd like to teach you how to be a family. Now I just cringe every time I think about it. I just
And what
guys out
you
yes
mean
every
by
time
your
I
home, you mean your home in LA with Michael, right?
right. We didn't
Okay.
even have a home at the time.
I
Right.
know. I'm just so it's not confusing to people. You weren't
Right.
inviting him to your home in Tulsa with your
No,
family. You were
no.
inviting him. Okay.
Yeah, get on that jet of yours and fly to Tulsa on Sundays. But the funny thing about it is he started really slowing down in his late 80s. He died at 91. And I'm telling you, every Sunday he was in town, he would have Andy, his limo driver, drive him to our home on Sundays. And a couple of the times he'd like stay all day. He'd like take a nap in a lounge chair. And Michael and I were like, well, I wonder if he's ever going to leave. I mean, I don't know. But he became a family. And I think he loved it so much because I always say this is when you are as successful as Armand was in life, you're not home at 5 o'clock to go to your son's baseball games. You're not around family, you're traveling the world. And I was able to show him a family. And I think he absolutely loved it. And there's that hilarious story in my book, Hammered, where he would come with all these toys filled in his limousine. He would have Andy take him to the toy store before they came. And I said to him one time, I called him Boompaw because the kids couldn't say grandpa, so we all called him Boom. They said Boompaw. I said, Boompaw, when you come, you don't need to bring gifts. You are the gift to us. And he looked at me and he said, I don't bring them, for the boys. I bring them for me. Isn't
Oh.
that interesting? And one time he comes around the corner for the Sunday brunch, and there is a kiddie pool tied on top of his limousine with ropes going through the window. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Is that hilarious?
I love that.
I know.
And so you obviously when you got involved and married into this family, you started traveling the world. You met all kinds of people all over the world, powerful people, politicians, Princess Di. I want to talk about Princess Di because you met her a few times and I think the last time you met her, and then you wrote her a letter, which we'll talk about, but the last time you met her, you shared Jesus with her. Like tell us about that.
Well, the first time, couple times I met her, we were at like polo matches. And, you don't really get a chance to visit much. It was mostly, as I said, with the Hammer family, pleasantries.
Mhm.
And I understood because she was so betrayed. She couldn't really confide in anybody. And why would she confide in me anyways? She didn't really know me. I was an acquaintance to her. But when you're at these events and it's, say, at the time, $50,000 a plate or $100,000 a plate, you're not going to get a bunch of 20-year-olds in there. They're all in their 70s, 80s. So they tended to group us together because we were both having sons the same time and we were the same age. And we just kind of exchanged pleasantries. Oh, isn't it wonderful raising our two sons, that kind of thing. But the third time that I met her, we were in Washington, D.C., and it was an event for, I believe, the Washington, D.C. Opera. And they had a VIP section, and there were only like 30 of us in there. And that's only because, again, we were riding on Armand's coattails. And Armand's wife had just died. So he asked if we would go to this event for him. And we're like, heck yeah. So we go, and she walked right up to me and she said, hello, Dru. And I had that brief moment where I'm like, this is the weirdest thing in the world that Princess Di just walked up to me and knows my name. I mean, it was just one of those like, this is so weird. And, I guess I curtsied. I don't know what I did. And she said, I just wanted to tell you that I'm so sorry about Frances's passing. She was such a lovely woman and she was always so kind to me. And then she leans into me and kind of looks around to make sure nobody's listening. And she goes, did you get the jewels? And I started laughing. I said, now, Princess Di, I said, you have a vault of royal jewels. Why would you even think about Frances's jewels? And she says, oh no, nobody had jewels like she did. I said, well, actually, I did, but I'd like to say something. I said, do you know what she took with her? None of her jewels. I said, when she lived on this earth, she loved Jesus. And she invited Jesus into her heart as her Lord and Savior. And that is all she took with her. So all this stuff around here, I said, nobody goes to heaven with a U-Haul. And she started laughing. I said, so you know what? I would recommend, thinking about inviting Jesus into your heart as your Lord and Savior. Because I thought, you know what? I mean, wherever we are, we're supposed to bloom where we're planted. And by the way, she was not any more important than anyone else we minister to. Everyone's the same in God's eyes, but I kind of laugh because my sons, I started ministering at the Los Angeles Dream Center and going down and working with, human trafficked victims and women out of prostitution and drug addiction and off the streets. And my sons laughed and they said, well, Mom, you finally found a group of women who will listen to you. Because I'd go all over Beverly Hills telling everybody about Jesus, and very few of them went for it. So I usually just ended up leading their housekeepers to Jesus. And guess what? They're every bit as important, right?
Yeah, of course. Of course. So what was her response when you said that to her, Princess
You know
Di?
what? She didn't say much of a response. She just kind of looked at me and smiled. And again, I don't think she would have ever gotten into it because anyone would have loved to gone to the press, oh, well, Princess Di said this, and, we had this conversation. She was so betrayed, and you don't know who you can trust in this life. But that gets down to what you had mentioned, reading about the letter that I sent her. So when it all came out, that their marriage was crumbling. It was like, I think 4 years later, the same thing was happening in my marriage. I found out about infidelity 7 years in, and I was so broken. And I think I was an exercise anorexic because I felt like that was the only thing I could control in my life at that time. And I would run marathons and I did everything to excess. And, I was skin and bones, and she had eating disorders that came out, and she was going through the same infidelities in her marriage. And I was praying for her. Not that we're friends, but I just had her on my heart because I knew what she was going through in a very small extent, because what she was going through was in the press all over the world. At least mine was more in the house, if you will.
Yeah.
So the Lord put on my heart to write her a letter. And I'm like, well, that's just ridiculous. That can't be the Lord. I mean, why would she care about, or how would she even get a letter from me? But Armand's assistant had her direct mailing address that would go straight to her assistant. And I didn't sleep for 4 days because God kept saying to me, write her a letter and complete the conversation that you started with her years ago. And I fought it and I fought it. Finally, one night I was exhausted and I got up in the middle of the night and I said, okay, God. And if I tell you, I honestly cannot even tell you what was in that letter. I remember the basics, like, I understand in a very smidgen, small way what you're going through. But I want you to know that I've been through the same heartache. Mine just wasn't, all over the press. And I told her how this is the time you can turn to Jesus and he will be there for you and he will carry you and he will heal your heart and he loves you. And I just walked through the plan of salvation with her. And, it's so embarrassing going to the post office. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. So I go and, you have to buy an overseas stamp at the time.
Mhm.
So I can imagine the postmaster and it says, Your Royal Highness, Princess whatever the title is. And I'm sure he's thinking, oh my Lord, this is like a child, writing a letter to Santa Claus.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. But I'm telling you, I mailed that thing off and I had such peace. And that night I slept like a baby. It was so amazing. So I guess the key there and the takeaway is when God asks you to do something, you better do it or you might end up in the belly of a whale.
Exactly. Exactly. I always say that. But so you, I think you mentioned this in the book that when she was in the fatal crash in 19, I think it was 1997,
Uh-huh.
that you think God spared her because she was alive for I don't know how much longer, 8 hours or
Right.
something. And so you think maybe in that time she may have had a moment of being able to accept Christ or right? Is that
Well,
correct?
yes, that's absolutely correct. And by the way, it isn't just Princess Di. Jesus says, I leave the 99 to
Hmm.
go after the one. And it says in the Bible that he gives everybody the opportunity to accept him. So when she was in that accident, it's one of those moments where you remember where you are. We were living in the Cayman Islands. And I remember praying, going, God, because they said that she was not dead when the ambulance came, that she was still breathing and alive. And I just kept praying, God, your words will never return void. And I just kept praying that God, even that letter, and by the way, I'm not pretentious enough to think I'm the only one that ever talked to her about Jesus or wrote her a letter, but there couldn't be a whole lot of us, right?
Hmm.
So I just kept praying and saying, God, you leave the 99 for the one, and she did not die immediately. And I pray that your words, as you promise, will never return void in her life. And I just happen to believe that she's in heaven,
Well, that would be amazing if when we get to heaven, if Princess dies there, that would be awesome.
right?
And so you mentioned so you were going through a divorce or you were going through infidelity with Michael. So
Yes,
Michael cheated on you and I think 7 years into your marriage and you ended
yes,
up forgiving him
yes.
and you worked, everything worked out until this
Until it
dream
didn't.
until it didn't talk about this dream you had and then how you confronted Michael later.
Okay. Well, so for 19 years, well, let me back up just a little bit. 7 years in, I found out about infidelities. And I believe in forgiveness. And the Bible even says, if you have something against someone else or them against you, go to them so that your Father in heaven can forgive you. Well, I don't know about you, Beckett, but I need forgiveness every day because I walk into place and I'm like, okay, who decorated this place? Now, this is a person talking with hot pink and lime green Druville in the background. So it's not a very good example.
By the way, we'll get into that. I mean, your
Yeah.
accidental career where you
Yeah.
ended up transforming and renovating beautiful homes and in Beverly Hills, all over the place. So we'll get into that in a minute, but go ahead.
Okay. So 7 years in, I was heartbroken, but also he was repentive. And repentance is turning 180-degree direction, going the opposite direction, never to return. That's true repentance.
Yes.
And that's what I believed. But I'm also tough. And I said to him, "Oh, I forgive you. This is what I'm called to do before God, and I need forgiveness all the time. B, I love you. C, I want a father for my children. I do not want my children growing up without a father in the home. It's the most difficult job in the world to be a single mother, because there's just something about a heavy of a father of, well, when your dad gets home type of deal that just puts the fear of God in them. So I really, truly believed that for 19 years after that, that he was totally faithful to me. And 25 years into our marriage, I started having all these health issues. And I think it's really interesting because I believe that sometimes our spirit man knows things that our physical mind has not quite caught up to yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's this kind of knowing, but not a knowing. And my body started falling apart. And I thought, well, I'm 49 and my husband's kind of irritating me, so I must be going through menopause. I mean, it just kind of made sense to me. So I went to a doctor and he took blood work, and he called me back when the test results came back, and he said, "I need to see you personally in my office." And I'm like, "Oh, great, I'm dying." So I go down and he said, "What in the world is going on in your life?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're anemic. Your body temperature is running at 92, yada, 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 all these other things. Your thyroid has shut down." And he said, "Every one of these symptoms is due to severe stress. So you need to go home and meditate." And I said, "Well, I pray to Jesus." He said, "Okay, well, go home and do that because you need to figure out what's going on in your life." So on the car ride home, I'm going through a list. I'm like, okay, so when people have severe stress, it's financial struggles, it's problems in your marriage, it's illnesses and family members. I'm going through the list and I'm going, no, 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 no. So that night when I went to bed, I prayed and I said, "God, obviously my spirit man knows something that my physical man does not know, and I need you to reveal it to me." Well, I'll let you read it in my book. That'll make people go buy it because all the proceeds go to help single mothers. So it's not for Dru Hammer. This is to help single parents that are really struggling raising their children, the proceeds from the book. So anyway, I had this horrific dream that I knew that I knew that I knew that infidelities were back in our marriage. So that night I approached him and I said, "Well, we can handle this two ways. You can lie about it and deny it, but I hear from the Lord. Or you can just come out and be honest, and we can figure out what we're going to do from this moment forward." Well, let's just say that when darkness is exposed in your marriage, all hell breaks loose. And that's what happened in our marriage. And I was so devastated because, when you walk down the aisle and you're 23 years old, you don't walk down thinking, "Well, maybe this will work. And if it doesn't, no big deal. We'll go on and do something else." No, because in my parents' example, I was marrying my soulmate and I was marrying the man that I was going to grow old with. And we raise our grandchildren together. If we're blessed, our great grandchildren together. And that wasn't meant to be. But I will say, I also would not have the passion that I have now through my foundation, Hammered Heart Foundation, or my Druville, which you said we want to get to, Exhibit A. I wouldn't have the passion to do what I'm doing if I hadn't been through what I went through, because I didn't understand the devastation of divorce. I didn't understand, I had a momentary time in my life where he shut all the bank accounts and, closed everything, and I was penniless. And gratefully, mine was short-lived, but there's a lot of women where it is not short-lived, and it's catastrophic what it does to a family.
Wow. Wow. And so you survived that. And then Michael, I think in 2022, he died of a brain
Yes,
tumor.
glioblastoma, brain cancer.
And
And,
did he get right with the Lord before that? Like what happened with?
a lot of people ask me, they say, "Well, do you think he's in heaven?" And I said, well, first of all, nobody's the judge of that except
Mhm.
for Jesus. But I will say this, he was a broken man and we had never dealt with our issues. But I really know that he still loved Jesus, because in the end, I would go into his hospital room or wherever he was in Santa Barbara. I went to see him, and Los Angeles, all different places. And I would literally crawl in bed with him and lay hands on him and pray over him and ask Jesus to heal him. And sometimes it doesn't turn out exactly the way we think it should be, but Michael got his ultimate healing and he is in heaven rejoicing. And I say, heck, he's better off than we are right now. So I know that he knew the Lord because we would cry together and we would pray together. And one time I was playing worship music with him in bed and praying over him. And he said, "Dru, I see angels." It was really beautiful. So yes, I would 100% say that he is in heaven with Jesus.
Wow. Praise God. And so
Yes.
before we get to Druville and your other projects, so as you say in the book, let's talk about the elephant in the room, your son,
Oh,
Armie Hammer,
I,
who obviously is a famous actor and in many movies, which I mentioned in the introduction. Uh, Talk about when Armie became an actor, what were your thoughts?
well, I was always the ever encouraging mother. And when he told me at 12 that he wanted to be an actor, I'm like, that's the worst job in the world. I go, why would you want to do that? Hollywood's so woke and it's ridiculous. Well, we didn't even know what woke was back then, actually, but whatever it is. And I prayed. I said, God, if this is what you have for my son, who am I to poo-poo it? But, this is a tough one. And there are millions of people that come to Hollywood every year thinking they're going to be this, instantaneous star. And it doesn't work that way. Even Armie beat the pavement for 7 years. But the first movie he booked, he played Billy Graham. And when I tell you he became Billy Graham, I don't know if I'm sure you can still find it on Netflix or something, but it's called Billy the Early Years. And it's a very small independent film. It's not the big, production, but it is the sweetest movie. And his first movie, he carried the entire movie. I think he was in every scene. And we all flew out to Nashville when he was doing the scene where Billy Graham gave the sermon of his very first church service. And he kind of fumbled around because he was new. We all have to learn as we go along. And in the end, after he gives one of the exact sermons that Billy gave, he puts his hands out and he says, "Give your life to Christ." Well, I was a chocolate mess by then. And I'm like, okay, God, I'm sorry. This has got to be what you have for him. If this is his first movie and he's actually having an altar call in the movie, are you kidding me? And I tell him every day. Not, well, I don't tell him every day. I tell him a lot of days. Armie, you literally do not have a chance in hell because you have a praying mother and I'm not stopping. That's just what it is.
So obviously he was in Social Network. He played the Winklevoss twins. And
Yes.
then tell us what your reaction was when you found out he was going to play this role in Call Me by Your Name with Timothy Chalamet, where he plays
Oh,
basically Timothy Chalamet's
must we
coming of
go to
age.
that one? Out
Well,
of all the movies, we had to go to that one, huh?
I just want to know your
Okay.
reaction when you found out this information.
Well, I went bat, you know what, crazy. It was not pretty. to be perfectly honest. And you know what? I'm going to say this because I was destroyed in the press because I did not want to go see that movie. And Armie was on, Jay Leno or something and says, my mom won't see the movie. Well, I supported him in every movie, but there's a reason. And whether it's homosexual or heterosexual, I don't want to watch my son having sex or in bed with anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And just as he would get totally creeped out seeing his parents in bed having sex, right? So I don't want to watch that. But here's how I describe it. And again, I'm going to get killed in the press, but oh well, worse things have happened, right? Are we going to please God or man? But here's what I said to him. I go, let's talk about this script, because I asked him if I could read the script. I said, you are a young professor and you are probably 15 to 20 years older than the young man in Italy. I said, you have a girlfriend at home. So you go to Italy and you prey on this young kid that supposedly was 17, because that's the legal age in France, but he looked 13. So you are actually switching roles because that's exactly what happened to you. You were preyed upon by an older young man, and that's been a real problem in your life. And
Right.
now you are that older man, and then let's take it a step further. Then let's go back to the States, propose to your girlfriend, and call him and tell him now you're engaged, the young boy, and destroy his life. So I said, let me ask you this. If Elizabeth was your girlfriend, that Elizabeth was his former wife, and you were dating, and you went to Italy, and you had a homosexual affair or even a heterosexual affair, and you don't tell her about it, and you go back and propose to her, do you think she would want to marry you? Would anybody marry you knowing that you had done that? So what Hollywood does is they twist the truth, and they turned a lust movie into a love movie.
Right. Right.
That's just it in a nutshell.
So just to clarify, what you just mentioned, that Armie, when he was young, he was molested by his youth pastor. That's what
Yes.
you're talking about.
Yes. Yes. So I said, Armie, how can you feel good about making a movie where now you are the predator? That young boy, again, he looked like he was 13, which is when it
Timothy
happened to you.
Chalamet. Yeah.
Yes. And now you are the predator, and you know how that destroyed your life temporarily, because I believe Jesus is healing him. But I said, how can you do that after knowing what you have been through? Well, Mom, I've played murders before and I don't murder people. I said, this is different.
Yeah.
I just believe it is.
Yeah. And then fast forward to, Armie has been through a lot in the last few years. How did you handle that when all the accusations about him came out? How did you handle that?
Well, it's the saying when it says a mother is as happy as her least happy child.
Mm-hmm.
And when you watch your son spiral and lose everything, looking back, Armie will say, and he has said on Piers Morgan and his own podcast, that I can say now it's the greatest thing that ever happened to me, because he now has been sober 3.5 years, and he got out of that just crazy world of everything being thrown at you.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, he's already filmed a movie again. But when your family is going through something like that, it's kind of like the Princess Di thing. When it's in public, it's even, exacerbated, if you will.
Yeah.
Armie says that at one time during COVID, he was the number 3 person, the third person in the world being Googled at the time. So I called him one day And I'm like, okay, I'm hearing this cannibal thing. I go, just level with your mother. Are there any limbs missing? Are
By
there
the
any
way,
girls
he was
out there?
accused of being a cannibal and eating like his
Yes, sorry.
girlfriend's hands or whatever. But yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
ribs. Yeah, he wrote
Ribs.
some stupid text. Boy, does he learn not to put anything in text. But I said, you wrote some dumb text, so you're dumb in that area. So smart otherwise. But I said, but are there any limbs missing? Are there any ribs gone out of any girl's body? No. And he starts laughing. I said, okay. He said, Mom, haven't you? I've heard you say before, oh my gosh, that baby is so cute. I could eat her up. He goes, but you're not going to eat that baby. I said, you're right. You're absolutely right. So the way I handled it is I did not want to write about it because it's not my story to tell. And Armie refused to talk about it. He just disappeared because he said, I will never say a bad word. I'm just going to move on in my life and the truth always comes out. And yeah, of course, a couple times I wanted to call him and go, well, if you're not going to talk about it, can I? Because these girls stayed in my home. I mean, these girls were madly in love with you. So can I talk? He's like, no, you cannot. So, anyways, he handled it way more maturely than I would have handled it. But it's so difficult when it's spread all over the newspapers. And I was even at a dinner party in DC, and this woman had no idea who I was, rightfully so. Why should anybody know? And we were talking about how woke Hollywood's become now. And she goes, yeah, I like that effing Armie Hammer. He's an effing rapist. And I'm like, okay, this is not going down well. So, and I thought, well, if they're talking about it at dinner parties, I can imagine what they're saying behind my back. But here's reality is when your name is out in public, it's just going to happen. You cannot control anyone's narrative. And I am not going to convince anybody. It's like if you're a Republican, nobody's going to convince anyone to be a Democrat or vice versa. But, you have to come to that on your own. And it was probably one of the most difficult things. And I didn't want to write about it. But my editor said, Dru, it's the white elephant in the room. If it was your nephew or a friend's son, you don't have to talk about it. It is your son. So I really prayed about that chapter and I sent it to both my sons because they were both going through things. My younger son had to handle a horrendous, lawsuits with someone Michael married that, changed wills. You know how that goes. And I sent them copies, and Armie and Victor wrote me back and said, we wouldn't change one thing. Write it,
Wow.
Mom, because I think you took a very fair approach. I was not one-sided. I was not, oh, my son's wonderful. He would never do anything like this. No, I say he was not criminally wrong. He was morally wrong, and I didn't raise him that way. Yet, this is going to turn for good.
Yes.
So, and I pretty much went into detail, as you know.
Yeah, you did. And you guys pick up the book and you can read more about that. Now, let's end on this because you
Okay.
have several projects you're working on now, one of which is Druville. Can you explain what that is?
Yes. So I started first with my foundation, and that's Druville. The proceeds will be going into the Hammered Heart Foundation, where I help single moms who aren't making it, and I can't give to individuals. I give to ministries, and I have a Hammered Heart Fund in some churches where they help buy them gas cards or grocery cards or make sure they have Christmas gifts at Christmas. So Druville kind of started organically because I have flipped now, I think it's 39 or 40 properties. And I just love the creative outlet. And Druville, the name came from I decorate in all hot pinks and lime greens and lemon yellows and bright blues, very Palm Beach style. And my sons, I heard them one time tell their friends, yeah, well, we basically grew up in Whoville because I decorate that way. So I thought, well, I think Druville's kind of apropos. So that's what I did. And I started a brand, and even at Christmas time, I'm doing Christmas packages so people can buy. I do these fabulous colored crosses, like big chunky paperweights, and I do necklaces, and I do the hammered hearts, and I have, melamine, all sorts of different products, and the proceeds go back into my foundation because I want to do it the way my dad did it. Is
Mhm.
I want to have a ministry, but I want to fund it from my businesses. So I never have to ask for, offerings or anything like that. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's just the way that I saw it work with my dad, and that's the way I chose to do it. So my book can be sold on either Druville or Amazon.com. And then I did an AI project, and it's called
Mhm.
GetHope.ai. And you can ask over 1,000 questions about the Bible. What does the Bible say? Not according to Dru Hammer, but what does the Bible say? And then I also do a 365 journey that you can get off of Druville or Hammered Heart or GetHope.ai. And I walk through the Bible in a year in less than 15 minutes a day. And I go through the 1 year Bible. So I sell journals if you don't have the Bible, so you can follow the text with it. But it's just a fun way to go through the Bible. And I'm a little wacky, as you can tell on this podcast. So hopefully I bring a little humor into it and some
But
fun
you're
little
wacky for Jesus, which
insights.
I love. You're very wacky for
Yes.
Jesus.
Yes, I am. I am, much to
I
my
think,
son's chagrin.
yeah, when we had dinner, it was so much fun. Speaking of wacky, we ended up praying for our waiter, which was
Yes.
at this
Yes.
restaurant in Beverly Hills, which was probably the first time that's happened. So
Yes. Yes.
that was a very fun experience.
So great.
Um, so yeah, we'll link to those below, to those websites, at
Thank you.
your website, and yeah, we'll leave it there. But Dru Hammer, thank you. And guys, the book is called Hammered. Pick it up. As Dru said, it's on Amazon or at, what did you say, druhammer.com?
Druville.com.
Druville.com. So pick up the book. Thank you for coming on the show, Dru.
Thank you for having me. I can't wait for our next dinner. That was so
I
much
know
fun.
it was so fun. Thank you. God bless you
Okay.
guys. We'll see you next time.